This is the Parents Who Think debate show, and today is episode 2 of 3 in the Should Parents Let Their Underage Children Drink Alcohol debate. I'm Danusha Malina-Derben, and if you're new to Parents Who Think, you could go back an episode and hear the start of this debate. If you do, you'll get to know the debate guests Kiaya, Dave and Casey and hear them briefly share their life stories. They sum up their views on the debate in the 6 words in the Say It in 6 segment and discuss whether they consider their argument or opinions predictable, progressive or polarising in the P that fits me. Now, we also talked about growing up and heard about the effects of parental beliefs around alcohol. I dish the dirt on this too. I share a bit about my own childhood and alcohol, my parents' relationship to alcohol, and a snapshot of where I am now with alcohol myself and with my 10 children. Now, all my guests, by the way, think their opinions are progressive. What does that mean in the context of PWT debates? PWT is Parents Who Think, by the way. Now, here's the definition we're using for progressive. A forward-thinking opinion that possibly expands predictable understandings. Each guest holds a forward-thinking opinion on this topic. Now, Dave is a no. Parents should not let their underage children drink alcohol. His father of one son was a heavy drinker for 40 years and is now a qualified trauma-informed coach. He's a significant force on social media talking about the harms of alcohol. Casey is a yes. Why the heck not let underage children taste alcohol? She's not using her real name, by the way, because she's afraid of how her mother would react if she were to hear her daughter's views about this topic. Casey has fostered several children of all ages. She's an entrepreneur and renowned author. Kiaya is also a yes. Underage children should be allowed to drink alcohol. She's a business owner and mother of 4. In her opinion, she's raising thinkers, not robotics. Her job, as she sees it, is to raise children ready for the real world, alcohol and all. Now let's agree that it takes a lot of courage to publicly discuss this controversial topic. I'm grateful my guests are willing to share their opinions on this because knowing how other people think and how they experience things is crucial. We need to hear different perspectives. It helps us find more of who we are and what we believe in. Now, this is Debate Done Different. Let's see how. First, a quick recap from Casey, Dave and Kiaya. Then we'll move on to hear guests in the Get Up on Your High Horse segment.
There is still shame that was unearned. My older brother and I were taught to feel a sense of shame around things like alcohol or sex, and those were unearned shame.
And what the alcohol did, it gave me confidence. It gave me a sense of belonging in the group. But what I want to sort of say here is that I had no education around alcohol. It's just what we did as kids, hanging around the shops.
I think I've seen Hennessy in the house. I wanted to know. I wanted to experience it. And I snuck and did it and didn't have anybody to talk to about it because we didn't talk to each other about it because no one's supposed to do it. So I don't want you to know that I did it, but I know you did it. I don't want that.
In episode 1, Casey shared about a terrifying event that involved her mother's friend, her mother, and a bottle of wine on the kitchen table. She grew up in a family environment where imbibing alcohol meant you were morally suspect.
I think I've blocked out a lot of it, but I definitely remember different phrases around alcohol. If we were at a picnic and other people were having a beer or whatnot, that there were certain judgments that were made about that, right? Somebody would be drinking some alcohol and my mother would shake her head and roll her eyes, or would mumble things under her breath like, ugh, stupid drunk. Or we were taught to believe that alcohol was very low class. I remember even going into my adult life and still having to struggle with this, even still now, around this concept of gendered judgments around alcohol, right? So somehow it was not as horrible in my family's mindset for a man to have a drink than it was for a woman. And definitely things like a woman who drinks beer is low class. A woman who drinks beer, especially out of a bottle or a can instead of a glass, is really low class.
What kind of gendered alcohol judgments is Casey struggling with, even now?
You know, if I go to a wedding and a bride is standing there in her beautiful $3,000 dress drinking out of a beer bottle, like I think, oh my God, that's so low class, right? So these concepts that have been stuck in my mind, I think that we're really raised to believe that alcohol is a crutch, that it is something that is used and abused, not enjoyed. And I think all these words were repeated over and over in my childhood.
Gendered messaging in Casey's childhood lives on. Let's take a quick detour into the power of gendered signals and alcohol. There's been a hefty trend towards female-focused marketing, which isn't a surprise given the rise in some or many women's socio-economic power. Lots of alcohol products have emerged that target female customers, from fruit-flavoured beers to low-calorie beverages. The focus is on slimness, weight, pink packaging, glitter, messages of sisterhood, all-female friendships, motherhood, and also the all-time favourite, sexiness. Messages of women's empowerment is in bottles, cans, and pouches. Celebrating being a woman has become synonymous with alcohol. Feminized marketing made the concept wine o'clock popular, linking it to how busy mothers can navigate anxiety. That means mothers use alcohol as an acceptable way to release stress, and many would say self-medicate and stress release. Alcohol has been sold to mothers as a kind of reward at the end of the day. Dave wrote about the mummy wine culture on social media recently. Why is it important to mention mummy wine culture and challenge that?
I just think, so I did a post about the mummy wine culture and I got ripped to pieces about that. I was a man of a certain age, shaming women for their mummy wine culture. And I wasn't shaming women. My intention wasn't to shame women. It was to highlight that is still rife in society.
Let's hear why Dave thinks the mummy wine culture is rampant.
I was in the carpet trade for a long time, 40 years, from a boy, really. I used to work in Wimbledon by the theatre. And I would go in houses and at 3:00, the door would open and, mums would come back with their little kiddies and that, and you would hear the pop of a Prosecco bottle and they would all have a drink and be laughing and happy. And it's where does that end though? Does it end with the 1 glass or the 2 glass and then go home and have tea and watch an episode of EastEnders? Or where does that end? And when you go in card shops, it's all focused at mums of, it's cool to drink and whatever. And I'm not sure it's changed that much now, but I think it's quieter because what happened in lockdown, and this is speaking from experience as well, Danusha, because I'm a grey area drinking coach and most of my clients are women.
Statistics back the idea that alcohol abuse among women is on the rise.
And you're not going to get a woman going to the playground, are you, with their hair done and makeup and a lovely coat saying, God, I had a right skinful last week. Anyway, anyone going down a pub tonight? Like you would the bloke getting in a van. And I find it's still rife in our society, but it's not spoken about as much. So I wanted to highlight that it is still rife in society.
Motherhood is hard. So there's this narrative about you need to reward yourself for dealing with what's been thrown at you. Actually, it's the structural problems of motherhood as well as the practical problems and issues and challenges, the lack of support in society for mothers, that then I think the drink, the alcohol culture and the industry exploits. And of course, women are leaning into that. And that's not to shame women.
No, but why wouldn't they? Because if it's that, well, obviously it is that difficult. And, especially with so much going on with now, after COVID, we got the cost of living crisis that's talked about. And why wouldn't we? Because this is what I say about it being so accepted in society. You wouldn't sit on a park bench with your kid and spark up a crack pipe, would you? Because you'd have your kids taken off you. But drinking is accepted. And what I find with it is that where it's gone underground a little bit, it's from COVID is where people are doing more the secret drinking.
Dave points to the way mummy wine culture slid underground in some circles.
But drinking is a coping mechanism to deal with external stresses and emotions. Yeah, and This is exactly what it is.
Social media was and is a big driver of feminised drinking, and it may be that mummy wine time started from a good place. Real motherhood on social media was once portrayed as breastfeeding in public, as one example, but then real images of motherhood got coupled with drinking. Images of bottles of wine in prams and buggies with messages like calm on the outside, Prosecco in the inside, were everywhere. And that's a sentiment that marketeers work to cash in on.
I just think it's a subject that is not spoken about anymore. And it should be, because lockdown has created so many problems with drinking. It really has. And, from my experience, the majority of women that come work with me are still reeling off the back of lockdown.
Here's Kiaya explaining how her children differentiate between her and her husband's alcohol.
My oldest will be 19 in September. My next one just made 16 in March. My next one is 9.5. He'll be 10 in December. And my youngest birthday was this week. She turned 7. Yeah. When I'm drinking wine, I ask, you want to sip? And they always say no. But I always offer it. My family calls, I guess you can call it liquor, which is not wine. Again, I'm still learning these things. So it's not wine, but the other stuff. They call it daddy juice. A drink is daddy juice. So now everyone calls it daddy juice. Now, what's funny is now that I've gotten into drinking, especially red wine, my children call wine mommy juice. My littles call wine mommy juice. So the non-wine items are called daddy juice and the wine items are called mommy juice. So if daddy drinks a glass of wine, daddy, why are you drinking mommy's juice?
Yeah.
Now, we didn't name it this. My oldest named it daddy juice and we've just called it daddy juice since. But they begin to tie that to that's just for adults.
Kiaya's eldest coined the phrase daddy juice in their family. Now, ironically, gendered alcohol marketing uses the mummy juice concept in alcohol adverts and products to tap into women's values of happiness, independence, and empowerment. Alcohol consumption has historically been taken to be a cultural symbol of manliness. Kiaya mentions how she suggests her husband takes their eldest son for a drink.
I can tell you with my oldest son, when he was a little younger, I can remember telling my husband, I think you should take him to get a drink. I think he needs to start learning how to be responsible if he decides to drink. And so that became like one of their, I don't know, like maybe once a quarter, to where like if I'm like concerned about something, but I prefer that it comes from a male to another male, I would say, I think you need to talk to him about so-and-so. And he'd be like, okay. Now, I don't know where they go, but I do know that if my husband has a drink, he'll order one for my son and they'll have their talk and I'm okay with that. It's supervised by his parent.
I'm wondering if you also see it as a masculine bonding activity.
Not particularly. No, I guess because I would do it. Like, I don't necessarily, I've never taken my daughter to have a drink. And I didn't necessarily take my oldest son to have a drink. We just happened to be there and I was going to have a drink. So I ordered one for him as well. And it could just be because while I'm a feminist, I don't believe in these roles, like male. I don't believe in those roles. Our household does not have these, mother roles, father
Gendered roles. Yeah.
No, not at all. So that's probably why I don't feel like it's that. I do know that oftentimes when my husband goes out with his guy friends, it's typically a drink. But again, I know that's their culture, to the point to where you'll hear some advocates just say that we're creating a culture of drinkers.
One of the earliest recognition of being drunk as a disease was accompanied by recognition of the family as what was called a vessel through which alcohol addiction could be transmitted across generations. Now, in 1835, Robert McNeish put forward a view in his book, Anatomy of Drunkenness, that drinking appears to be in some measure hereditary. It frequently descends from parents to their children. Now, this can come from example and imitation, but there can be little question that in many instances it exists as a family predisposition. Now, that's what Robert McNeish wrote way back then. Now, the belief that alcoholism was a product of heredity and parental example grew throughout the 19th century. Richard Peabody, a leading lay therapist in the 1930s, believed that there were three basic causes of alcoholism. 1. Inheritance of a nervous system which was not resistant to alcohol. 2. The effect of the early family environment. Or 3. The influence of later experiences in marriage, college, or work. He emphasised the parental role as a causative agent of alcoholism. Now, his followers were way more specific in blaming mothers. In this more specific view, maternal domination and a shy, despondent father led to feelings of inferiority, can't even say the word, and nervousness, which in turn encouraged alcoholism.
And then, of course, for me, one of the things that was really drilled into us as children is that you can be, and so we were always told by our mother that you can be an alcoholic and never drink. So you can be somebody who has a propensity to not be able to have just one drink, right? And so my mother would always tell us that she was an alcoholic, even though she doesn't drink, and that, that she can't have a drink because it could be this horrible slippery slope and she could become a drunk. And that was really terrifying for us as children, is that we believed that if we took a sip of something, that maybe we would then drink the whole thing. And if we drank the whole thing, then we would have to have 2 or 3 or 4. And if we had 2 or 3 or 4, would we be drinking every day? And would our whole lives go down the tubes? And so we believed that a single sip of alcohol was sort of a gateway to a horrible life. And that's how we were raised.
Yeah, I mean, a single sip of alcohol could be your moral decline.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, actually, you becoming something unrecognizable. And it sounds like the heart of her fears were about being a drunk,
Yes.
being a weak, immoral, low-class drunk.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, when we had some people in our family, we didn't have a whole lot of money growing up. We were on the sort of poor side of middle class. If we were even that far up there, we were okay. We were fine. But we did have some people in our family relatives who had a little bit more money and who built homes that had a wet bar in the corner of the living room, right there, a little counter with a sink and, where the glasses hung and whatnot. I remember my parents looking at things like that and shaking their heads and rolling their eyes and being like, oh my God, what kind of ridiculous, pitiful person would need to put something like that in their house? Even just the concept of it being in someone's home. Or I remember television commercials for alcohol, my parents thinking that was horrible, that alcohol was advertised anywhere. So my parents' default state that they preferred that we pretended that alcohol didn't exist. And when we were forced to confront that it did, that we really, really did sort of demonize it.
In episode 1 of this debate, Casey talked about being made to attend Al-Anon meetings for children of alcoholics when she was young. Except her parents didn't drink. These are the parents she just talked about who tried hard to pretend alcohol didn't exist. This dual approach, the recognition of the power and effects of alcohol to children, and attempts to ignore it, were responses to her parents' experiences of growing up in families with troubling relationships to alcohol. Dave takes us back to a shame he faced.
Obviously, in your teens, you're going out clubbing, meeting girls and getting up in the morning after 2 hours sleep, and within an hour, your hangover's gone. But through my 20s, I started going to a local pub. And then in my 30s, I started drinking indoors because someone had accused me of being an alcoholic, and it really hit me. I'm really sensitive. And so I used to hide it. And that led to then only drinking indoors. And that led from beers to wine. And then I put on a load of weight, and then Googling vodka, which I never used to drink spirits. So I ended up in my 40s drinking a bottle of vodka every night. So, but I will say that I was separated from my son's mum, and he used to come over for the weekends, and I made it an absolute non-negotiable not to drink when my son was there.
I had lots of questions about how Dave managed to not drink when his son was with him. I left them because Dave was on a roll.
And I'll be the first one, Danusha, which goes against the grain of what I'm saying here, but I remember on his 16th birthday, taking him to his private golf club. He was a member of this club, and he was a junior captain, and buying him a beer on his 16th birthday and having a photograph taken with him and putting it on Facebook going, now he's a man, because he had a beer in his hand, right? But obviously I was still drinking then, and I didn't know anything about it. It was just something I did. I had no education around it, anything. I was so naive, and I didn't want to believe it anyway because I love drinking. But in hindsight, it was not what I would do now, put it that way.
Yeah, how do you feel about that photo?
Well, I've shared it on my social media since stopping drinking, and I've talked about it, and I feel shame in a way, like that I behaved like that. But I also feel slight compassion about myself because I was in a position myself that I was in trouble with alcohol, and I didn't know any better. I was that typical mid-40s bloke of, yeah, my son loves a beer and we go out and get drunk together kind of thing. And we did do. And there are other occasions as well that I think I'm so lucky, Danusha, that my son didn't go on to develop a drinking problem, because if I'd have encouraged him at 13, 14, 15 to say, you know, drinking's fine, mate, come on, have a beer with the old man, it's Christmas or whatnot, and then how would I feel if he developed a dependency to alcohol later on in life? How would I feel in myself now? Because that photograph alone makes me feel bad, let alone if he was in and out of rehab and he's lost his job or his marriage is broken up because of his drinking. So, you know, I look at things like that, really.
Why didn't he develop dependency then? Given your drinking was pretty extreme, wasn't it?
It was extremely extreme, if that is a double word there, extremely extreme. It was ridiculous in the end, but I realised that I used it as a coping strategy. I didn't deal with any of the childhood trauma that I went through with mum leaving. It affected relationships for the next 30 years or so. And I put it down to maybe genetics. His mum never drank and doesn't drink. And he could luckily have some of her genes there, because I know for me, there's a whole conversation about the genetics of alcoholism, right?
We can trace historically how in society alcohol problems have been redefined from moral problems to genetic ones, and onwards into recovery and family advocacy. Casey's childhood focused heavily on the moral issues of alcohol. Dave has this to say.
You're not born an alcoholic, but I think you can be vulnerable to certain substances. And I've had genetic tests done since I've got sober, and I have a faulty dopamine receptor. I'm very low in serotonin. I'm very low in vitamin D. And these can all contribute to me being vulnerable to a substance to help me, right? And that's what it is, isn't it? It's a coping mechanism, drinking, when it gets out of hand. And I'm just so lucky that George didn't develop that, because he's pretty much a take or leave it drinker. Now, he can go for months and then he'll go on a few nights out and have a few drinks, but then he'll rein it in again, you know? So I feel really fortunate there.
But there's more.
So I suppose there were elements of me buying him that first beer and encouraging him, like telling him he's now a man because he's drinking. At 16, he might have thought, yeah, I am. And my dad's proud of me. He's proud of me because I can drink with him now. That's got to be the wrong reasons, right?
I remember when my son was, before he went off to college, because you kind of graduate young here, when I think he was 16 or 17, we went to go pick up dinner. Friday night dinner was typically pizza or some junk. And we were sitting at the bar waiting for our order to come. And I said, oh, can we have 2 so-and-so and so? And he kind of just looks at me, because here they don't really card. So he kind of just looks at me and he says, you know, that has alcohol in it. And I said, yes, and I'm his mother. So go ahead and give it to him. So when I say parental supervised underage drinking, I don't want you to give my child a drink without me or his father or their father being there. You don't get to make that choice. That's our decision.
In episode 1, Kiaya shared about her experience of the differences between Black culture and white culture around drinking. I couldn't help but notice the edge behind her words. You don't get to make that choice.
You didn't ask that question, but I do want to say that when it comes to how someone of African descent or a darker skinned person or a Black person or a darker brown person or whatever we want to call them, when it comes to a person, because I actually refer to us as brown people to my children, but when it comes to people of African descent, there are just some things we need to undo and not make them so taboo. So even the fact that I would have the opinion that, yes, I let my children sip. Yes, I would buy my child a mixed drink. Yes, when we go out, if we go to Emancipation Festival, we would tell our children, the 2 older ones, don't drink with so-and-so and so-and-so. Don't leave here and drink. But as long as you're here and we're around, because they're not with us, they're there, because it's kind of like a big area. But as long as you're here, yeah, you can buy something. Don't get messy. And that's just been the way we've done it. Our children know, don't drink without us. So if we're not in the vicinity, do not drink.
I wanted Kiaya to share more on Black and brown people undoing taboos.
Remember I told you that there's a big difference between raising a white child and raising a Black child?
Yes.
It's a lot of that.
Right.
There's a lot of undoing of our slave mindset that needs to it needs to be undone.
Can you say a bit more about the slave mindset?
Slave masters beat their slaves. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Black parents beat their children. Similar to the slave masters beating of their slaves. If you don't do what I tell you to do, you get in the South where I'm from, you would say you get a whooping.
Mm-hmm.
I think white people would call it a whipping, but I think a whipping and a whooping are 2 different things.
Yes.
Here they call it a beating. So a whooping is a beating. It's not like beating your child, but to whoop them. Yeah. And I don't believe in that. I actually would tell people when they were like, you don't beat your children. I'm like, what are they, slaves? I can remember telling my mother one time, I'm not a slave. A slave descendant's genetic code that just needs to be undone. It's been passed down from generation to generation, and it is scientifically proven to be in our genetics that we have to break ourselves. Like you can't do it. I have to break it myself and then not pass it down to my children. So my mother yelled a lot. So I tried to practice not yelling. It was not beneficial for me at all. It never got her the results that she wanted, ever.
When Kiaya was talking with me, she told me she was defiant. It's a strong word.
I'm very, very, very defiant. I'm very defiant.
See what I mean?
I don't want you to choose for me. I have a brain. I can think. I'm educated. I'm intelligent. I'm an avid reader. I'm just always learning. I'm not stupid. I'm not ignorant. I'm not dumb. So, for instance, if reading was against the law for slaves back in the day, I would read because you don't want me to. Defiant.
Yeah.
Defiant. I would read. I would learn to read.
So actually your stance on alcohol and letting children taste and underage drink alcohol is defiance, but it's also breaking the imprint of being told what to do.
It's normalizing things that are very taboo. That's actually what I call it. It's taboo. It's not taboo. It's not. Just because you say it is, and just because I say it isn't, doesn't mean that it is or it isn't. But to me, it won't be taboo. And in the Black community, there are so many things you're not supposed to do.
Yes.
Just like slavery.
Yeah.
I want to undo that, and I don't want my children to pass it down to their children.
In Kiaya's family, dad and son go to a bar and talk with a drink. From the outside, this could look like a milestone mark on the way to adulthood or embedding masculinity norms. Dig deeper, and we find Kiaya is claiming her agency as a brown person, freeing herself from slave descendant genetic codes. Now, normalizing alcohol is one way forward. Some say this is unhelpful because it is then seen as an ultimate symbol of maturity, a rite of passage or milestone. In episode 1, Casey said when she was really young, she'd been terrified of alcohol. But when she became a teenager, it became a different story. Let's hear how.
So that was a really interesting transition. And a lot of things happened in my life when I was a teenager that all, I think, cumulatively resulted in certain types of behaviors or experiences. But I was certainly taught when I was younger that lonely, depressed, desperate people turn to the bottle, right? And so that's exactly what my brother and I did when we were feeling lonely and depressed and desperate. So my parents divorced when I was a teenager, and they were both so wrapped up in what they had going on in their world. So my dad moved out and we stayed with my mom, and my dad was very much wrapped up in his new life and his new girlfriend and his new apartment and the new choices he was making and the new way that he dressed and whatnot. And at home, my mom, because the divorce wasn't her idea, though ultimately was actually quite healthy for her, I think, in the long run, she was so very wrapped up in sort of a situational depression around this, and then developed anorexia and started controlling her circumstances by starving herself, which was really, really hard to, my brother and I essentially had to sort of care for her. I had to summon up the kind of courage that we had to have when we wrote her that note and said, please don't drink that bottle of wine. We had to summon up that kind of courage to be able to confront her and say, Mom, like, you're sick, like, you have to eat. My mom was so emaciated that my mom, had to get a job, and she would go to work and she would come home and she would lock herself in the bedroom and she would cry. And we lived in a very small home, and there was no escaping that. There was no escaping the sadness and the crying and the bitterness and the things she was saying about my dad, and the stories she was telling us about him that we didn't want to hear, that were arguably traumatic and not good for us to hear. And so we wanted to get away.
Her brother was older and had a driver's license, a car, and a lot of friends. Some of these friends were older than him.
And while hanging out with our friends sometimes meant really sort of innocuous, normal teenage things like sitting around in lawn chairs or playing frisbee or playing catch or going on trips to the movies or the mall, it also often meant wine coolers and tequila shots and screwdrivers. And I remember, I think because alcohol had been so demonized in our household as children, we certainly were not going to tell our mom or our dad, hey, I tried a wine cooler and it tasted really good, or I had two and it made me feel dizzy, and so we weren't going to ever talk about it because we didn't talk about those kinds of things. And so we became sneaky little liars, right?
With parents involved in their own big life changes, Casey and her brother went free range.
But alcohol, and we knew this because we'd been told, was powerful and it was mysterious. So when we were teenagers, that power and that mystery and things that had really been wrapped up in fear suddenly became intriguing. They became alluring instead of scary. And so my brother and I started drinking all the time, and sometimes drinking to excess, sometimes drinking until we were passing out or vomiting.
Although Casey didn't vomit, her brother did. She passed out.
And it really became a little bit dangerous, right? So it went from, I'm curious about this, to it became a pastime for us. And I can say now, looking back on it, that I was a teenage alcoholic. I wanted to be cool.
Her parents demonized alcohol and linked it to moral judgments about lonely, depressed, and desperate people. Now, when their children experienced these emotions and found themselves without support, they turned to alcohol. Here's a question from Casey.
But I wonder, had my parents taught me that alcohol is a beverage, it's just a fermented beverage, that it's morally neutral, if they taught me that alcohol was morally neutral, that my decision to take a sip or an entire glass or 2 glasses of something didn't change who I was at my core, that it didn't change my values or who I was morally, might the mystique have been gone? But for me, that wasn't my reality. And so for me, the rebellion in my teenage years around doing precisely what we had been told was horrible and horrific, that rebellion is what made it alluring. And interestingly, when I look back on it now, I mean, I have no tally of how many cocktails I had over the years, but I would guess that I probably did more drinking between the ages of 16 and 22 than I did for the following 25 years.
Lots of parents take the view that positioning alcohol as forbidden fruit will make kids want it more. Some say it's better if we let them have a sip of ours at dinner, or buy our teens cans of weak beer to keep them off the stronger stuff. I asked Dave this.
What would you say to someone that says, look, Dave, why can't I give my child half a glass of wine over a Sunday roast when we go out? Why not?
Well,
What's the problem with that?
Well, you can. It is your choice as well.
But what's the problem with that?
I think it's a bit like playing Russian roulette, to be honest. Like, they're too young, their brains haven't developed. I mean, I've looked at this, that the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus don't develop until your early 20s, right? And alcohol can really stunt the growth of that, where their decision making, all of that, And is it not like Russian roulette where you're dancing with the devil there? Like, all right, have half a glass of wine with your dinner on Sunday, and then have another one there. It's another Sunday, and then it goes on like that. And I just think it's too risky. And I know there are going to be people on here saying the opposite of that, but I'm only judging this by what I know and what I've learned about it. And I've seen so many times it go wrong. And, that can lead on to all sorts of problems. So is it really worth the risk?
I'm guessing that it links so firmly to our own relationship with alcohol as parents, doesn't it?
Do you know what? That's a brilliant point. And I was going to go on to that because a lot of the time, and this might be controversial and it might be the same as that post I did on mummified culture, but I would like to explore the conversation with the parent of why they think it's okay to give their child a drink. Because look at me, for an example, when George was 16, and it was all about me, not about him. That was all about me saying, yeah, my son's 16, he's a man now, and we can go and drink. It had nothing to do with him. It's all about me and what I wanted.
It meant something to you, didn't it?
Yeah. A milestone, it was all about my drinking. So it could justify my drinking as well. When I was saying, we can go out for drinks together, and next time we go out for a meal, I'll buy you a pint, mate, and whatnot.
Dave is talking about the link between our choices and agendas as parents, and whether they're really about the children or about ourselves, or remnants of unresolved emotional needs and wounds. In episode 1, Dave told us about after his mum left the family home with no explanation, how he found belonging so hard, until he started drinking with the lads as a schoolboy.
I was going to say, wasn't that about your belonging? He could now join you.
100%. Join me in what I'd manifested in my life as a coping strategy. So he could be my ally in that coping strategy, which would make it seem okay for me, even though I knew it wasn't. And believe me, there were times that we went out in Clapham and I left him at the train station, staggered home and fell asleep by the time he got home, and I didn't even check on him, which I'm highly shameful about. But that was then. Do you see what I mean?
Kiaya didn't learn to drink till she was in her 30s. Her husband showed her how.
And so when I ask my husband, like, how do you keep from getting drunk or not drunk, but how do you keep from hangovers? How do you keep from being like sloppy drunk, messy drunk, falling over the floor drunk? What do you do? And he says, you don't mix, lights and darks. And I said, oh, really? So as my husband began to teach me, because here in the Caribbean, alcohol is a part of their culture. Like, it's just what they do. And there are things that are okay here that are not okay somewhere else, that are okay somewhere else that are not okay here. And they have to be prepared for all of it as much as possible. Mm-hmm. So if I was home and I mixed a drink, or mostly my husband, I don't do the mixing, and I would ask them if they want to taste it. And I can remember, like the first times, they don't like wine, but I didn't like wine either. But, the mixed fruity drinks, it's like, you want to taste? Yeah. Okay. Here, take a sip. It just became something that we do.
As a brown parent, Kiaya is not only breaking slave descendant genetic codes, she's giving permission and educating her children for their future.
We gave them the permission with us by saying, here, do you want to taste this? And then we would kind of gauge what they thought about it. Like one of my favorite drinks was Amarella Sour. And they call it juice because it's sweet. Well, now that I don't like white wines except a Pinot, I don't like the sweet stuff anymore. I don't like it. But they'll say, oh, that's sweet. That doesn't taste like an alcoholic beverage. And then for me, that creates a conversation. Yes, there are the fruity drinks. There are the sweet drinks. There are the colorful ones. And they have alcohol in them. And that's why you have to be careful when you're drinking them, because they are sweet, they are pretty, they are fruity, they are these beautiful colors, but it's not juice. It is an alcoholic beverage. And if you're not careful, it will creep up on you. So it always gives us an opportunity to have a conversation without, really standing over them with, you don't drink and you don't this and this is that. And no, it's just a conversation between a parent and their child. It's a learning opportunity.
She's teaching her kids and defiantly busting taboos.
I don't want to feel like the children are sneaking to drink. No, that's not who we are. We talk about these things. We explore, we answer questions. And if you want to drink, you don't have to hide that. Ask us. We'll tell you what to get.
This transparency and conversation is a response to Kiaya's upbringing in a Christian home where alcohol was strictly prohibited. Her job is to counterbalance what she experienced. Oh, at least that's what it sounds like.
So this isn't just about underage drinking. This is about identifying the whys and ensuring that they have the hows and the why nots, and just holistically training up a young person, a little person, as I refer to them.
Endorsing drinking alcohol as just something we do is commonplace. Cultivating a culture of dialogue with our young children and teenagers about alcohol is something all my guests agree on. Casey told me that after her parents' divorce, when her mother was depressed and anorexic, she asked her mum if she could see a therapist to help process what was going on. The answer was this.
We don't talk about our problems with strangers, and that's ridiculous. And, you're not crazy.
So Casey worked a part-time job, found a therapist with sliding scale fees, and a friend dropped her off at sessions.
And I was paying for therapy to try to process what had happened with my parents. And I never once told my mom that I was going to therapy after that, but once she had said no to the idea of me going. And so she never knew that I was going. And I never told her about how I was coping or processing any of it. And so even the healthy things I was doing for myself as a teenager, like getting mental health support, that was a secret too. So how we took care of ourselves and how we experimented and how we found ourselves and how we sometimes made mistakes, all of that was under the cover of darkness. Every single part of who we were and who we were becoming as teenagers was kept a secret.
So build the link then for us in why you think parents should let their underage kids sip alcohol, fermented beverage, as you've said. Why does that need to be not a secret? Why does that need to be in the open, talked about?
I think the more that it's a secret, the more that what is not a big deal can make someone feel really bad about themselves. When somebody really does have an alcohol problem, if we don't talk about it, they don't get help. I have an alcoholic cousin and no one talks about it. And we were all at an event once. I was an adult and he got into his truck to drive away after this event. And I was getting into another vehicle with my mom and some other family members. And he had probably a dozen cocktails at this event. And he was slurring his speech and his face was all red. And he was clearly impaired by the alcohol. And I started to get out of the vehicle I was getting into to try to stop him and ask for his keys. And my mother said, "Don't," and grabbed me by the arm when I tried to speak up. And my family, it became really clear to me in that moment, would rather that my cousin kills a minivan full of kids than that he yelled at us for getting involved in his business, or that someone becomes so estranged from us that they don't show up for Christmas. Or maybe it's just that, quote unquote, we don't talk about it, right? That the alcohol taboo runs so deep in our collective denial, it is more important than my cousin's safety. And it's more important than his life or the lives of others on the roads where he's driving intoxicated. And I think that as I look back on it, I feel so strongly, and maybe it sounds counterintuitive, right? That I grew up with these taboos and that I wouldn't want to perpetuate them, but it didn't work for me.
Dave has another kind of dialogue in mind.
By educating our children about the dangers of alcohol, we support their own knowledge around the subject. Informing children about the effects of alcohol has on the body, which will help them be equipped to make informed future decisions. Using our influence as parents, we could set good examples around alcohol. A lot of children grow up in the standard open wine bottle on the counter, lots of empty bottles in the recycling bin. I know of people that ask their kids to pour their drinks for them, and it doesn't exactly set a good example. And I think by normalising drinking in a child's life often means that alcohol will play a part in some shape or form.
Instead of endorsing access to alcohol, Dave wants us to stop normalising alcohol as something adults do. Let's take alcohol off the pedestal of adulthood.
But in reality, where children have access to alcohol, whether it's with permission or not, a cocktail cabinet, nicking the gin out of the cabinet, beers in the fridge, if it's encouraged, there's every chance it could play a role in a child's future. And I do a lot of work with the National Association of Children of Alcoholics, and I've heard and witnessed the devastation of what they've been through in their childhood, not only from experiencing their parents drinking throughout their childhood from an early age, but being constantly promised things and being let down, having their basic emotional needs not met, poor role modelling, seeing their parents misuse alcohol can set a negative example. Social isolation because they don't want to invite their mates round after school because their parents could be drinking, And it's basically, I think, inconsistency in parenting, really.
Definitions of alcohol, alcohol dependency, and social drinking aren't clear-cut. And what does poor role modelling look like? Is it the parent with zero alcohol in the home? Some would say create mystique about it. Is it the parent who pours children sips of alcohol in the hope that doing this takes away a need to lie and might mean their kids avoid dangerous situations? There are so many more scenarios of role modelling to choose from.
But I think things are very, very different these days. We talk about a lot of things that we didn't used to talk about when I grew up. We didn't talk about emotions. We didn't talk about anything. And I think we have a real opportunity here to help our children in their lives to understand more about things like this.
But talking about alcohol and condoning underage children drinking alcohol are different things. What's a helpful parental stance for you? As you listen to guests, what are you hearing? And how does this relate to your experience as a child and as a parent? I asked each of my guests a straight shooting question next.
What would you say to people that would say that alcohol is toxic, that it's negative to facilitate, encourage, give permission, call it what you will, a poison, a toxin into a little person? What would you say to them?
I would say, first of all, I'm not giving them a full drink. I'm giving them a taste. I'm giving them an opening into that world so that they don't have to try to jump into it later. I'm giving them the opportunity for them to decide that's yucky. I don't like that. Kind of like I did. I'm not going to drink. That's nasty. Unfortunately, mine was very unsupervised. I'm giving them a supervised time and place to test it out before they're at the point to where they can actually do it and don't have boundaries. I'm teaching them how to have boundaries because, all of these things come with the development of the frontal lobes, but you can still give them the information so that when the frontal lobe is developed, the information will be there. That's what I believe train up a child means. Give the information so that when the information is able to be used, it can actually be used. Number one, they're tasting. They're taking a sip. They're not drinking.
Kiaya's eldest son is an elite athlete, so they talk about nutrition and the effects of alcohol on his performance. His father taught him this.
So, and then one of the things that I know his father has taught him, because his father has told me that the alcohol doesn't stay in him when he, drinks, he has to go to the bathroom. So I would always ask my son, did you pee? Drink your water, make sure you pee. Drink your water, make sure you pee. You're an elite athlete. This is not the time to be drinking. So I do believe that we have to give our children the information and leave them to make wise decisions with the understanding that they're not always going to make wise decisions because I'm over 40 and I still don't make wise decisions all the time. But they have the information.
Side note, I once took an in-depth course on alcohol, retention of alcohol, effects, and so on. Now, the idea that if we urinate, alcohol leaves our body, not quite straightforward. There are many variables at play. Kiaya has more to say about her younger two.
And for my little people, again, it's a sip. And if that sip has a higher toxicity than the air that they're in every day, then we really have a problem, because toxins are everywhere that we go. We know this. We're always told to eat this food, eat that food, take these, nutrients and those nutrients so that our bodies can fight the toxins that are just in our water, in our air, in our food. I would tell that person, for my little people, not my big son, but for my little people, for my 16-year-old, a swig is not worse than the food that they're eating.
I asked Casey this question. What would you say to people that would argue that alcohol is not a fermented beverage? It's actually the only legitimate drug that is out there that everyone just says, yeah, I'll have that. If it was a drug, we would look at that differently. But some people argue it's a drug.
Well, I certainly think that, like anything, there are a lot of things that start out morally neutral that when handled in excess can become dangerous, right? You're not probably going to get sick if you eat one cupcake. But if you have 17 of them today, you're probably going to, at the very least, get a bellyache. And if you eat 17 of them every day, you're going to end up with type 2 diabetes. I would say to people who are afraid to talk to their children about alcohol or to let them try a sip, first of all, your children are smart. Children get it at a very young age that if you don't trust them or if you mystify something, they want to go solve the mystery, right? And wouldn't it be safer to help them understand it with you by their side?
But Casey, did you get it? Did you get it? Were you smart?
Not until I was probably, mid-20s, but I don't know how a child can get it without appropriate influence from, their parents or adult figures in their lives. Alcohol, yes, of course, it can be horrible. It can destroy lives. It can make people behave violently. It can do all kinds of horrible things in the wrong hands and in excess. But I believe that living in a world in which we only think of it in a polarizing way, that either you don't drink at all or that you are a drunk, and that there's nothing in between, I think doesn't address the reality of how alcohol can and should be incorporated into society. And I think it creates a problem, because if my only choice as a child or as an adult is that I don't drink or I'm a drunk, that doesn't give me a whole lot of options.
Let's finish today's episode with a question for Dave.
So, are there any circumstances that you think parents should let their underage kids drink alcohol?
No, to be honest. I really can't think of any. I don't see why we would.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Parents Who Think. Next week, I'll bring you episode 3 and the close of this debate. Meantime, I'd love to welcome you over at the Parents Who Think Substack community or on our Parents Who Think YouTube page. Take care, everyone.